I make films. That way I express myself. If my expression is alienated, so what? At least I'm expressing myself as free as possible. I don't want to talk about myself anymore. I've already said too much. Everyone knows I pay the consequences for my actions. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just want to say that we're all in danger.
If this is your view of life, how do you plan to avoid the danger and the risk that you describe?
It's late. We should stop. Perhaps you could leave the questions with me. I think some of the points are flat. I'd like to think about them. I feel much more comfortable writing than talking like this. I can make some notes and get them to you tomorrow. Do you have a title? What about We're All in Danger?
And that's a clip from Pasolini, and I'm delighted to say we've been joined by Willem Dafoe, who is Pasolini. Willem, hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Tell us how you got involved with the movie.
Well, I had worked with the director Abel Ferrara before, and basically we knew we wanted to make a film that had something to do with Pasolini. We didn't know exactly what. There was no script, so we kicked around some ideas, and this is the result of a process deciding how to frame our story and make it.
So what was it that made you think that you wanted to make a movie about Pasolini? What is it that you wanted to put over?
Well, we both live in Italy, so he's not just because of that, but he's a particularly strong influence on us. He was really a prophet. Both of us have great admiration for his work, and as a cultural figure, how he lived, how he died, where he figured in Italian culture is something very interesting and something that we can learn from even today.
So the film tells the story about his last couple of days. Why did you decide, if you're going to play Pasolini, if you're going to make a movie about Pasolini, why did you concentrate exclusively on that small window?
You've got to figure out how to, you've got to make a structure. And there's many ways you could approach his life, his work, and this was just sort of the most practical way for us. We started interviewing family and friends, and we thought the best thing to do would be to make a very precise structure. And we created a scenario that was really built from the details of those interviews. So we had sort of a factual or a documentary approach to making the structure, and then we fleshed it out from there and just really tried to inhabit that scenario. And also be able to present some of his material and try to, at least to our minds, approximate where we imagined he had arrived at a life that was cut short, where he was at.
And cut short in a particularly brutal way, because he's killed by a gang. I'm not sure if it's a burglary or if it's that they object to his homosexuality, but it is particularly brutal. In Italy, is this still discussed? Who killed Pasolini sometimes seems almost to be like who killed Kennedy.
It's exactly that. It is still discussed, and we really made a conscious choice to make sure that wasn't what the movie is about, because we do deal with his last days. That's certainly part of it, and it's also, of course, an ending. We didn't want to shy away from it, but one of the challenges was to tell that part of the story without taking a clear, expressing an opinion about actually what happened, to make the event without showing our hand.
Yeah. And while he's an iconic figure in Italy, my guess is he's not really an iconic figure in a lot of the rest of the world. You've already referred to him as a prophet. Could you just convince maybe a skeptical audience, just explain what it is about this man that made you think he's a prophet and is so extraordinary?
My way of convincing is to try to make the movie, and then people take it from there. But I get it. Well, why is he a prophet for me? Just the things that he was talking about, a certain kind of evolution of Italian culture and even Western culture. He was very prescient. He really saw certain changes that were going to happen, and he spoke to those things. And he was a very articulate guy, and he always sort of defended and was interested in what was human, what was vital. So he railed against certain kind of education systems, certain kind of materialism, certain kind of flattening out, a certain kind of homogenization. He felt like people were losing their sense of self, their identity, their specificness, their humanness. Everybody wanted the same thing. And I think as I'm going into this litany of his thoughts, I think this all sounds very familiar.
So what was the fight that he was fighting?
To try to celebrate and find what's human. I mean, sometimes he was known very much for loving to hang out with very simple people. But here he was a very erudite, intellectual, much accomplished in many fields, a very cultured guy. But the people that he preferred, he said jokingly or not so jokingly in one interview, he preferred people with less than a fourth grade education. Because he felt like they were more connected to their humanness, what was vital. They were emotional. They weren't dead. They weren't in a lockstep that was dictated from someone else. He made a very beautiful documentary in the 60s interviewing people about sex, and one of my impressions from watching that was how people take their attitudes and their attitudes and their tastes and their desires from someone else. They don't really take it from themselves.
Is it true you didn't really know that much about Pasolini until Martin Scorsese recommended The Passion of Matthew prior to doing The Last Temptation of Christ?
That's half true. I knew of him, but only I knew some films. But I didn't know about his critical writings. I didn't know his poetry until my Italian wife turned me on to those. I didn't know. I knew his novels existed, but I had not read them. But of course, all these things through time I did become acquainted with. And the fact that Martin Scorsese told me to look at Passion According to Matthew was very important.
Because your movie, the Pasolini movie, starts with him editing one of his more controversial movies with some pretty grim scenes from Salo. But then it's worth remembering that The Passion According to Matthew is there, which is on the Vatican-approved list, one of their 50 top movies of all time. I mean, they don't obviously call it that, but effectively they're saying, go watch this movie.
It's true. It's true. Well, it's a powerful movie, and sort of like Last Temptation. It always amazes me that the religious right took offense to that movie when it's a movie that really does address the spiritual matters.
And I think you've made this connection that in the same way that was a Jesus and not the Jesus, I think you believe that this new movie is certainly a Pasolini, not the Pasolini.
Certainly. It's our Pasolini. It's what it was. Our portrait from our experience of him and our love for him and our admiration for him.
And if someone comes out of your movie and wants to go and see something and go and start afresh and thinks, maybe I should go and look at this work, where should they go? What would you recommend? He's
shot some beautiful movies, some not so beautiful maybe. His poetry is very beautiful. Get any collection of his poetry. Read his poem about his mother. Also his critical writing. The thing that I came to at the very last was his critical writing, particularly his late critical writing, the Corsair writings and the Lutheran letters. this is sort of included in some of the thoughts. He expresses some of the thoughts that he writes about in those letters in the last interview in the movie. So if you see the movie and you really respond to that interview, that's where to go.
I just have a few questions from listeners just before you go. Willem, the last time you were on the show was for Antichrist. So here's a question from Brian Shano, who says, do you agree with Mark? He's our movie critic. Do you agree with Mark's assertion that just because you were in Antichrist doesn't mean you understood it?
Oh, absolutely. What's to understand? I mean, a movie is a complex thing. People are going to have different understandings. They're going to have different reactions to it. Thank God. There's no one interpretation.
Jamie Britton's question next. Can you ask Willem how he managed to give one of the greatest performances I've ever seen in Paul Schrader's Affliction, despite being in it for about 10 minutes, barely moving, and acting opposite Nick Nolte?
That's very kind. Look, I like that material. That was a very beautiful story, very beautiful novel by Russell Banks. So I felt somehow connected to it. Not so much from my personal life, but it spoke to me. Thank you. I had worked with Paul Schrader before. He had a very simple, direct approach to it, and I think it suited the movie.
Jeff Hannon's question: Where can I get your jacket from Grand Budapest Hotel?
That's a tough one. That's a one of a kind, and I'm sure it's under lock and key somewhere.
David Proctor's question, finally: how bonkers was the set of Heaven's Gate?
It didn't start out bonkers. It was interesting. Who knows what came first? The pressure from the studio, the panic from the studio, or Michael Cimino's perfectionism? But the two was sort of a bad mix. When after the first couple of days, we were a week behind. That made the studio very nervous. And we know the rest of the story, but there was a lot of tension. There were a lot of good intentions to make a very uncompromising, beautiful movie. But people lost their nerve halfway through, and some crazy stuff happened.
Yeah. Willem, we appreciate your time today. Thank you very much indeed. What's next for you after Pasolini? What are you working on next?
I worked with Hector Babenco in Brazil in a movie called My Hindu Friend, and I just finished a long time in China with Zhang Yimou on a big movie called The Great Wall. So both of those should be coming out not soon, but in the next year.
Look forward to that. Willem Dafoe, we appreciate your time.
Thank you. Okay, be well.